Welcome to the Avram Davidson universe, where you will get to listen to some of the best short stories ever written. As a youth, Neil Gaiman fell in love with Avram's stories. Philip K. Dick adored him. Ursula Le Guin thought his tales wonderful, and Ray Bradbury compared him to Kipling. Each episode will include a special guest, an amazing short story, and a discussion of that story. Enjoy classic tales such as O'er All the Seas with Oysters, The Golem, The Sources of the Nile, and many others.
How could you be? It sounds like a story to me, yeah. Sounds like a story to me.
Anyways, Alan, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure.
Well, I'll start with, I know you have a new hobby actually, which I really appreciated you sending me a sample. Tell me a little bit about that.
I started writing orchestral music in April. I've always heard it in my head, but since I have no musical training and can't play an instrument, kind of difficult to get it down to where you can listen to it or play it. And software has come a long way in as far as music goes too. And I started playing around with some free software, and it doesn't sound like the Vienna Philharmonic, but it's not bad. And I found that as I hunted and pecked, I learned a lot. I learned I knew what an arpeggio was, but I didn't know what a lot of other things were. They call them articulations, and there are a lot of other things too. But I just played around with it and gradually got to where I thought I could put some sounds together to where it sounded like something. I always knew the orchestra because I grew up listening to classical music. So I can tell an oboe from a clarinet kind of thing. And I heard the music in my head and I just hunted and pecked, as it were, until I could get something down. And I feel that I've gotten, over the last 8 months, better and better. I did a few short pieces and then I did a little suite, and I've done 3 symphonies. So.
Well, I appreciated the piece you sent me. Did you any training at all, or just completely just self-taught?
Self-taught. A lot of composers are self-taught. I'm starting kind of late, but at least I got some things down that other people can listen to that I've heard in my head for the past 60 years. And that makes me feel really good. That's and great. Maybe someday, you can print out, the software lets you print out parts. Maybe someday somebody will be interested, a college orchestra or something, in playing some of it. I think most of it, or at least some of it, is fairly listenable. What did I send you? The last movement of the Third Symphony?
Yeah.
Or the Second Symphony, or Third Symphony?
I think it was third or first.
Third, probably. I don't know. I can't remember either. And that was just a little while ago. That's why you got to get things down. They tend to go away after a while.
Right.
So yeah, I had a lot of fun. Doing that.
Well, thank you for sharing it. So, obviously I'm reaching out to hear a little bit about your thoughts on Avram, and, I'm curious if you were a fan, when you first heard about him, what you know about him, just sort of your thoughts on him.
When I started reading science fiction, I started collecting, not as a collector, but to read the stuff. There used to be about a dozen really good used bookstores on Hollywood Boulevard, and I would haunt the science fiction sections for things like the Groff Conklin anthologies, the August Derleth edited anthologies, Judith Merril. Back in the early days of hardcover science fiction, and I'm talking late 40s, early 50s, you had this enormous backlog of science fiction that had only appeared in pulp magazines, basically, pulps and digests. And so anthologists had this enormous reservoir of material that had never appeared in book form. And they were able to acquire it, I'm sure, very cheaply. And they would go through and you would have these enormous, wonderful anthologies with 40 or 50 stories in them. And that's how I was really exposed to a lot of science fiction. Of course, I read some novels too, but this was great. You'd go and you'd spend $3 for a beat up old Groff Conklin Treasury of Science Fiction, and you'd get 50 really good science fiction stories. And it exposed me to a lot of writers that I'd never heard of any of them. a lot of writers and a lot of stories and concepts that I've never encountered before. I still have all of those books. I kept them. I started collecting, but not fancy. But you used to be able to buy really nice books before the advent of the fax machine and then the internet for $5, $6. I mean, not The Outsider and other or things like that, but fantasy press books, gnome press books, the early specialty publishers, and also books from major publishers like Doubleday, which was usually, they did limited press runs anyway. In the course of doing that, one of the writers I encountered was Avram Davidson. And I'm a language nut, not just because I became a writer, but I love language, any language. But since I speak English, I'm always looking for a different turn of phrase or a new word, but it has to be in a story that makes sense. I'm not big on junk. I mean, it could even be space opera if it's good space opera. And there are only two writers whose use of language I encountered who really struck me as unusual. One was Ari Lafferty, who's actually a gnome from another dimension. And the other one was Avram. And so I started, I would look for stories. And then when I bought an early anthology called All the Seas with Oysters, I think, or All the Seas with Oysters.
Yeah.
And then I bought the Treasury when it came out. And I enjoyed every story, even if I wasn't. The thing about stories by Avram, we'll do Lafferty for another time.
Yep.
This is about Avram. The thing about Avram's stories is it doesn't matter what the story's about. If you come across a writer who is really, really good with language, this is Joseph Conrad, let's say, it doesn't matter so much even what the story is about, because you go through, it's like eating a cake and the cake is gone and there's nothing left but icing. And if you like the icing, you can do without the cake being the story, the icing being the use of language. And when I started writing, I tried to do that sort of thing. I thought, well, if Avram Davidson and Ari Lafferty can do this, I can do it. Well, guess what? There are certain things that you just can't imitate because it comes across as a bad imitation. There are no good imitations of Avram Davidson and Ari Lafferty because they were unique. Their use of language was unique. And in that regard, I just stopped and started writing. I stopped worrying about style because there was this beautiful style and this wonderful use of language, and I couldn't do it. So I figured I'd better do what I can do and not worry about trying to imitate somebody else. Beginning writers have a bad habit of trying to imitate successful writers or writer whose work they admire, and that won't get you anywhere. So that's how I came upon Avram Davidson and his wonderful use of language. I mean, the Morris Goldpepper stories, just for instance, those are not serious stories. A lot of Avram's stories are not serious stories.
Right.
But those in particular, you can tell when he was sitting down to write those. It's like, now I'm going to talk about the color of a chair. How can I make that interesting from the standpoint of the use of language? And he's just having fun. That's what storytellers do, is if they can have fun, story kind of writes itself.
Is that, I mean, if you had to choose an Avram story, and I know there's so many, but a favorite, would you, there are a couple that stand out to you?
Well, Morris Goldpepper, Help, I Am Dr. Morris Goldpepper.
Yeah.
And the other one would be Where All the Grasses Grow, which was very much ahead of its time in its subject matter. That's what science fiction is supposed to do, even though it's a really fantasy story. But that struck me. That was not a funny story.
No, that was a serious story.
Avram could write serious stories too. And what it struck me when I was reading that story was, this is actually a Twilight episode that was never filmed, because I could see the whole video production of that story, because there are not a lot of characters in it. It's really about making a point, and it does that very powerfully. And the other interesting thing I found out about that particular story is the use of language in that story, compared to a lot of Avram's other works, very subdued. And from reading it and from seeing that, I could tell that he wanted to say something. It's like, I've got something important to say here, and I'm not going to throw funny phrases out at you because I want to get my point across. And you can see that when you read the story.
Yeah, interestingly, one of the things in both stories that I've found kind of fascinating is he will take some things that are real and put them in, and some things that are not. So, for example, the tribe name is not a real tribe in The Grasses Grow. And you're never sure. That's one of the things with Avram's work that I always find fascinating. And we're going to listen to Dr. Morris Goldpepper, but he'll throw things out there that you have to look up, that you have to search for it. And I don't know, that's not normally when you read a novel, you're not usually having to look things up. They're spelled out for you. Is that a uniqueness to him? I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
No, but it is unique to really good fantasy of a certain kind. Lovecraft, just to pick one example, was famous for that. He would use real star names, and his geography would be real, but he was telling a horror fantasy story. L. Sprague de Camp was famous for that. Sprague had an enormous reservoir of knowledge about things like history and ancient cultures, and he would throw all that stuff into the fantasy stories, and you would think, well, wait a minute, this actually was the fourth Roman emperor. Why is he in this? And it gives the fantasy a believability that a lot of other fantasy stories don't have. It's not necessarily the best way to do it, but it is a way to do it. The other way to do it, of course, is to go the Tolkien route and put so much background into your story that you feel that it's a real place when it actually is completely invented.
Okay. In Or the Grasses Grow, and this is just more of a question of time. I mean, it seems like now that almost seems like a story that someone would write now, maybe, as opposed to then. And is that a fair assessment? Is that way ahead of its time, or were people very sensitive to it then as well, in terms of?
You didn't. No, it was definitely ahead of its time. You just didn't find stories about the plight of Native Americans, if I can simplify it, from that era. Never mind in fantasy or science fiction, you didn't find them anywhere. So it's very striking to see that particular story. And you could tell from reading the story that was something that deeply interested Avram, and that he picked up on it and decided to write about it because he felt it was an important subject that was being ignored. That's not always the basis for a fantasy story. It could just as easily, I don't want to put people off reading, could just as easily have been an article in Collier's or Saturday Evening Post if you take the fantasy elements out of it, if you can take the fantasy elements out of it. Maybe I'm reaching a little bit there, but it's a serious point about a serious subject that was not being addressed. Fantasy and science fiction in that respect have changed a great deal. Mm-hmm. And nowadays, a lot of science fiction is, I hate to use the word woke, because there's a lot of negative connotations now. But basically, it's like, I'm going to write a story set in a futuristic city. How can I have that reflect on our urban problems today? People who were writing science fiction fantasy back in the 40s necessarily didn't do that. There were a few writers who were prescient, without trying to be necessarily. One certainly was Robert Sheckley. And they would throw these things. Sheckley did a story that came out in 1950, if I remember, called Watchbird, about armed drones and the danger they could pose. And that's just crazy in 1950. And of course, there's Murray Leinster's Logic Named Joe, which was an astounding in 1946 and predicts the home computer and the internet. 1946. It's crazy. Well, here's Avram writing a fantasy story. Those were both science fiction, writing a fantasy story about Native American problems and injustice. And he didn't sell it on that basis, but I think he wrote it because he had something important to say. The fact that it's a really good story and so well crafted, all of Avram's stories are well crafted. It makes you sit up and take notice. It's like this guy saw something when nobody around him was seeing anything, because nothing prevented anybody else from writing stories like that about that subject. There probably are a few, I'm just not aware of them at the moment. And then we have Dr. Morris Goldpepper, who is a dentist. Now, how many science fiction stories do we have from, forget the date of the story, about dentists? It's just not, I wrote a novel once, and I thought, what can I do that nobody's done? Well, if you try that with science fiction, you're probably bound to lose. So the craziest thing I could think of was to start the novel in a bowling alley in New Mexico, because I had never read a science fiction story that started in a bowling alley, and it is integral to the story. Well, I'd never read it until I read the Morris Goldpepper stories. I'd never read a science fiction story about a dentist. Plenty of stories about aliens, but not dentists. And it is actually, in a way, integral to the story. When you come across something you've never come across before in fiction, you really sit up and take notice. It may not win the Nobel Prize, but if you are of that bent of mind, you'll look at it and say, that's new. That's new. I like that. People are hard to surprise, and science fiction readers, fantasy readers can be among the hardest readers to surprise.
So with Avram, Lafferty, folks like them, why do you think they're not better recognized or slowly being forgotten? And any thoughts on that?
All these things go in cycles. Part of the problem, I think, is that with Avram is he's primarily, correct me if I'm wrong, a short story writer. And the stories have been anthologized many times. Now they're available online. It's extremely difficult for publishers to put together anthologies with these old stories because they've been anthologized so many times. If you don't win an award, for whatever that's worth, or you don't have a bestseller, it becomes difficult. I don't think Avram will be forgotten. I don't think Lafferty will be forgotten. I don't think Harlan will be forgotten. Interest may lapse, but if the story is well crafted, sooner or later, somebody's going to rediscover them, and it's going to be, it's a big rediscovery. That happened with Cordwainer Smith, who quickly faded from view for a while, except among dedicated fans, and now is known as one of the great writers of science fiction. I certainly consider him as such. That's another one who stylistically I would put in the same category as Lafferty and Avram, even though he wrote almost exclusively science fiction and not fantasy. People you can read just for the beauty of the language. Story content aside.
Well, let's take a quick break and listen to Help, I'm Dr. Morris Goldpepper.
Help, I am Dr. Morris Goldpepper. 1. 4 of the men, Weinroth, McAllister, Dunbourge, and Smith, sat at the table under the cold blue lighting tubes. One of them, Rourke, was in a corner speaking quietly into a telephone, and one, Fatterman, stood staring out the window at the lights of the city. One, Hansen, had yet to arrive. Fatterman spoke without turning his head. He was the oldest of those present, the Big Seven, as they were often called. Lights, he said. So many lights. Down here. He waved his hand toward the city. Up there, he gestured toward the sky. Even with our much-vaunted knowledge, what, he asked, do we know? He turned his head. Perhaps this is too big for us. In the light of the problem, can we really hope to accomplish anything? Heavyset Dunbourge frowned grimly. We have received the suffrage of our fellow scientists, Doctor. We can but try. Lithe, handsome McAllister, the youngest officer of the association, nodded. The problem is certainly not worse than that which faced our late great colleague, the immortal Morton. He pointed to a picture on the paneled wall. "And we all know what he accomplished." Fetterman went over and took his hand. "Your words fill me with courage." McAllister flushed with pleasure. "I am an old man," Fetterman added falteringly. "Forgive my lack of spirit, Doctor." He sat down, sighed, shook his head slowly. Weinroth, burly and red-haired, patted him gently on the back. Natty, silver-haired little Smith smiled at him consolingly. A buzzer sounded. Rourke hung up the telephone, flipped a switch on the wall intercom. "Headquarters here," he said crisply. "Dr. Carl T. Hansen has arrived," a voice informed him. "Bring him up at once," he directed. "And Nickerson?" "Yes, Dr. Rourke." "Let no one else into the building. No one." They sat in silence. After a moment or two, they heard the approach of the elevator, heard the doors slide open, slide shut, heard the elevator descend. Heavy, steady footsteps approached, knuckles rapped on the opaque glass door. Rourke went over to the door, said, "A conscientious and diligent scientist must remain a continual student." A deep voice finished the quotation. Rourke unlocked the door, peered out into the corridor, admitted Hansen, locked the door. "I would have been here sooner, but another emergency interposed," Hansen said. "A certain political figure, ethics prevent my being more specific, suffered an oral hemorrhage following an altercation with a woman who shall be nameless, but boy did she pack a wallop. A so-called specialist gentleman with offices on Park Avenue had been, as he called it, applying pressure with a gauze pad. I merely used a little gel foam as a coagulant agent, and the hemorrhage stopped almost at once. When will the public learn, gentlemen?" Faint smiles played upon the faces of the assembled scientists. Hansen took a seat. Rourke bent down and lifted 2 tape-recording devices to the table, set both of them in motion. The faces of the men became serious, grim. "This is an emergency session of the steering committee of the Executive Committee of the American Dental Association," Rourke said, "called to discuss measures of dealing with the case of Dr. Morris Goldpepper. One tape will be deposited in the vaults of the Chase Manhattan Bank in New York. The other will be similarly secured in the vaults of the Wells Fargo and Union Trust Company Bank in San Francisco. Present at this session are Doctors Rourke, Weinroth, and Smith, President, First and Second Vice Presidents, respectively, Fetterman, Past President, McAllister, Public Information, Danbourge, Legal, and Hansen, Policy. He looked around at the set, tense faces. "Doctors," he went on, "I think I may well say that humanity is, as of this moment, face to face with a great danger, and it is a bitter jest that it is not to the engineers or the astronomers, not to medicine, nor yet to nuclear, nor any other kind of physics that humanity must now look for salvation, but to the members of the dental profession." His voice rose. "Yes, to the practitioners of what has become perhaps the least regarded of all the learned sciences. It is indeed ironical. We may at this juncture consider the comments of the now-deceased Professor Ernest Houghton, the Harvard anthropologist, who observed with a sorrow which did him credit that his famed university, instead of assisting its dental school as it ought, treated it, and I quote his exact words, like a yellow dog." His voice trembled. McAllister's clean-cut face flushed an angry red. Weinroth growled. Danbourge's fist hit the table and stayed there, clenched. Fetterman gave a soft, broken sigh. "But enough of this. We are not jealous, nor are we vindictive," President Rourke went on. "We are confident that history, with its long tomorrow, will show how, at this danger-fraught point, the humble and little thought-of followers of dental science recognized and sized up the situation and stood shoulder to shoulder on the ramparts." He wiped his brow with a paper tissue. "And now I will call upon our beloved past president, Dr. Samuel I. Fetterman, to begin our review of the incredible circumstances which have brought us here tonight. Dr. Fetterman, if you please." The well-known elder statesman of the ADA nodded his head slowly. He made a little cage of his fingers, and pursed and then unpursed his lips. At length he spoke in a soft and gentle voice. "My first comment, brethren, is that I ask for compassion. Morris Goldpepper is not to blame. Let me tell you a few words about him. Goldpepper the scientist needs no introduction. Who has not read, for instance, The Bilateral Vertical Stroke and its Influence on the Pattern of Occlusion, or his Treatment, Planning, Assemblage, and Cementation of a 14-unit fixed bridge, to name only two. But I shall speak about Goldpepper the man. He is 46 years of age and served with honor in the United States Navy Dental Corps during the Second World War. He has been a widower since shortly after the conclusion of that conflict. Ray, the late Mrs. Goldpepper, may she rest in peace, often used to say, "Maury, if I go first, promise me you'll marry again." But he passed it off with a joke, and as you know, he never did. They had one child, a daughter, Suzanne, a very sweet girl, now married to a Dr. Sheldon Fingerhut, DDS. I need not tell you, brethren, how proud our colleague was when his only child married this very fine young member of our profession. The Fingerhuts are now located on Umbalupi, one of the Micronesian islands forming part of the United States Trust Territory, where Dr. Sheldon is teaching dental hygiene, sanitation, and prosthesis to the natives thereof. Dr. Hansen asked, "Are they aware of—" "The son-in-law knows something of the matter," the older man said. "He has not seen fit to inform his wife, who is in a delicate condition and expects shortly to be confined. At his suggestion, I have been writing, or rather typing, letters purporting to come from her father on his stationery, with the excuse that he badly singed his fingers on a Bunsen burner, whilst annealing a new type hinge for dentures, and consequently cannot hold his pen." He sipped from a glass of water. "Despite his great scientific accomplishments," Dr. Fadiman went on, "Maury had an impractical streak in him. Often I used to call on him at his bachelor apartment in the Hotel Davenport on West End Avenue, where he moved following his daughter's marriage, and I would find him immersed in reading matter of an escapist kind. Tales of crocodile hunters on the Malayan Peninsula, or magazines dealing with interplanetary warfare, or collections of short stories about vampires and werewolves and similar superstitious creatures." "Maury," I said reproachfully, "what a way to spend your off hours. Is it worth it? Is it healthy? You would do much better, believe me, to frequent the pool or the handball court at the Y. Or," I pointed out to him, "if you want to read, why ignore the rich treasures of literature, Shakespeare, Ruskin, Elbert Hubbard, Edna Ferber, and so on? Why retreat to these immature-type fantasies?" At first he only smiled and quoted the saying, "Each to his or her own taste." The silence which followed was broken by young Dr. McAllister. "You say," he said, "at first." Old Dr. Fadiman snapped out of his reverie. Yes. But eventually he confessed the truth to me. He withheld nothing." The assembled dental scientists then learned that the same Dr. Morris Goldpepper, who had been awarded not once but 3 successive times the unique honor of the Dr. Alexander Peabody Medal for New Achievements in Dental Prosthesis, was obsessed with the idea that there was sentient life on other worlds, that it would shortly be possible to reach these other worlds, and that he himself desired to be among those who went. "Do you realize, Sam," he asked me, reported Fadiman, "do you realize that in a very short time it will no longer be a question of fuel or even of metallurgy? That submarines, capable of cruising for weeks and months without surfacing, foretell the possibility of traveling through airless space? The chief problem has now come down to finding how to build a takeoff platform capable of withstanding a thrust of several million pounds." And his eyes glowed. Dr. Fadiman had inquired with good-natured sarcasm how the other man expected this would involve him. The answer was as follows. Any interplanetary expedition would find it just as necessary to take along a dentist as to take along a physician, and that he, Dr. Goldpepper, intended to be that dentist. Dr. Weinroth's hand slapped the table with a bang. By thunder, I say the man had courage. Dr. Rourke looked at him with icy reproof. I should be obliged, he said stiffly, if there would be no further emotional outbursts. Dr. Weinroth's face fell. I beg the committee's pardon, Mr. President, he said. Dr. Rourke nodded graciously, indicated by a gesture of his hand that Dr. Fadiman had permission to continue speaking. The old man took a letter from his pocket and placed it on the table. This came to me like a bolt from the blue beyond. It is dated November 8th of last year. Skipping the formal salutation, it reads, At last I stand silent upon the peak in Darien, a literary reference, gentlemen, to Cortez's alleged discovery of the Pacific Ocean. Actually, it was Balboa. My great dream is about to be realized. Before long, I shall be back to tell you about it, but just exactly when I am not able to say. History is being made. Long live science. Very sincerely yours, Morris Goldpepper, DDS. He passed the letter around the table. Dr. Smith asked, What did you do on receiving this communication, Doctor? Dr. Fadiman had at once taken a taxi to West End Avenue. The desk clerk at the hotel courteously informed him that the man he sought had left on a vacation of short but not exactly specified duration. No further information was known. Dr. Fadiman's first thought was that his younger friend had gotten some sort of position with a government project which he was not free to discuss, and his own patriotism and sense of duty naturally prevented him from making inquiries. But I began, for the first time, the elder statesman of American dentistry said, to read up on the subject of space travel. I wondered how a man 46 years of age could possibly hope to be selected over younger men. Dr. Danbush spoke for the first time. Size, he said. Every ounce would count in a spaceship, and Morris was a pretty little guy. But with the heart of a lion, Dr. Weinroth said softly. Miles and miles and miles of heart. The other men nodded their agreement to this tribute. But as time went on, and the year drew to its close, and he heard no word from his friend, Dr. Fadiman began to worry. Finally, when he received a letter from the Fingerhuts saying that they had not been hearing either, he took action. He realized it was not likely that the government would have made plans to include a dentist in this supposed project without communicating with the ADA, and he inquired of the current president, Dr. Rourke, if he had any knowledge of such a project or of the whereabouts of the missing man. The answer to both questions was no. But on learning the reasons for Dr. Fadiman's concern, he communicated with Colonel Lemnell Coggins, head of the USAF's Dental Corps. Colonel Coggins informed him that no one of Dr. Goldpepper's name or description was or had been affiliated with any such project, and that, in fact, any such project was still, as he put it, still on the drawing board. Drs. Rourke and Fadiman, great as was their concern, hesitated to report Dr. Goldpepper missing. He had, after all, paid rent on apartment, office, and laboratory well in advance. He was a mature man, of very considerable intelligence, and one who presumably knew what he was doing. It is at this point, said Dr. Danbush, that I enter the picture. On the 11th of January, I had a call from a Dr. Milton Wilson, who has an office on East 19th Street, with a small laboratory adjoining where he does prosthetic work. He told me with a good deal of hesitation that something exceedingly odd had come up, and he asked me if I knew where Dr. Morris Goldpepper was. The morning of the 11th of January, an elderly man with a curious foreign accent came into Dr. Wilson's office, gave the name of Smith, and complained about an upper plate. It did not feel comfortable, Mr. Smith said, and it irritated the roof of his mouth. There was a certain reluctance on his part to allow Dr. Wilson to examine his mouth. This was understandable, because the interior of his mouth was blue. The gums were entirely edentulous, very hard, almost horny. The plate itself— "Here is the plate," Dr. Danbourge said, placing it on the table. Dr. Wilson supplied him with another. "You will observe the perforations on the upper or palatal surface. They had been covered with a thin layer of gum arabic, which naturally soon wore almost entirely off, with the result that the roof of the mouth became irritated. Now, this is so very unusual that Dr. Wilson, as soon as his patient, the so-called Mr. Smith, was gone, broke open the weirdly made plate to find why the perforations had been made. In my capacity as head of the association's legal department," Dr. Danbourge stated, "I have come across some extraordinary occurrences, but nothing like this." This was a small piece of a white, flexible substance, covered with tiny black lines. Danbourge picked up a large magnifying glass. "You may examine these objects, doctors," he said, "but it will save your eyesight if I read to you from an enlarged photostatic copy of this last one. The nature of the material, the method of writing or of reducing the writing to such size are all unknown to us. It may be something on the order of microfilm, but that is not important. The important thing is the content of the writing, the portent of the writing. Not since Dr. Morton, the young Boston dentist, realized the uses of sulfuric ether as an anesthetic, has any member of our noble profession discovered anything of even remotely similar importance, and perhaps not before either." He drew his spectacles from their case and began to read aloud. 2. Despite the fact that our great profession lacks the glamour and public adulation of the practice of medicine, and even the druggists, not having a Hippocratic oath, can preen themselves on their so-called Oath of Maimonides, though believe me, the great Maimonides had no more to do with it than Morris Goldpepper, DDS, no one can charge us with not having as high a standard of ethics and professional conduct as physicians and surgeons, M.D. Nor do I hesitate for one single moment to include prostheticians not holding the degree of Doctor of Dental Surgery or Doctor of Dental Medicine, whose work is so vital and essential. When the records of our civilization are balanced, then, but perhaps not before, the real importance of dental science will be appreciated. Now it is merely valued at the moment of toothache. It is only with a heavy heart that I undertake deliberately to produce inferior work, and with the confidence that all those to whom the standards of oral surgery and dental prosthetics are dear will understand the very unusual circumstances which have prompted me to so to do. And understanding will forgive. No one can hold the standards of our profession higher or more sacred than I. It must be admitted that I was not very amused on a certain occasion when my cousin, Nathaniel Pomerantz, introduced me to an engineering contractor with these words, "You two should have a lot in common. You both build bridges," and uttered a foolish laugh. But I venture to say that this was one of the truest words ever spoken in questionable jest. Humility is one thing, false pride another. Those who know anything of modern dentistry at all know of the Goldpepper Bridge and the Goldpepper Crown. It is I, Dr. Morris Goldpepper, inventor of both and perfecter of the semi-retractable clasp which bears my name, who writes these words you see before you. Nothing further should be needful by way of identification. And now to my report. On the 1st day of November, a day of evil import forever in the personal calendar of the unhappy wretch who writes these lines, not even knowing for sure if they will ever be read, but what else can I do? Shortly after 5 p.m., my laboratory door was knocked on. I found there a curious-looking man of shriveled and weazened appearance. He asked if I was Dr. Morris Goldpepper, the famous perfecter of the semi-retractable clasp, and I pleaded guilty to the flattering impeachment. The man had a foreign-sounding accent, or I thought it may be that he had an impediment in his speech. Might he see me, was his next question. I hesitated. It has happened to me before, and to most other practitioners. A stranger comes, and before you know it, he is slandering some perfectly respectable DDS or DMD. The dentist pulled a healthy tooth. The dentist took such and such a huge sum of money for new plates. They don't fit him. He suffers great anguish. He's a poor man. The dentist won't do anything, etc. ad infinitum nauseamque. In short, a nut, a crank, a crackpot. But while I was hesitating, the man yawned, did not courteously cover his mouth with his hand, and I observed to my astonishment that the interior of his mouth was an odd shade of blue. Bemused by this singular departure from normalcy, I allowed him to enter. Then I wondered what to say, since he himself was saying nothing, but he looked around the lab with interest. State your business would be too brusque, and why is your mouth blue would be too gauche. An impasse. Whilst holding up a large-scale model of the Goldpepper cap, not yet perfected, will it ever be? Alas, who knows? This curious individual said, "I know all about you, Dentist Goldpepper. A great scientist you are. A man of powerful imagination you are. One who rebels against narrow horizons and yearns to soar to wide and distant worlds you are." All I could think of to say was, "And what can I do for you?" It was all so true. Every single word he said was true. In my vanity was my downfall. I was tricked like the crow with the cheese in the ancient fable of Aesop. The man proceeded to tell me, frankly enough, that he was a denizen of another planet. He had 2 hearts, would you believe it, and consequently 2 circulatory systems. 2 pulses, one in each arm, one slow, the other fast. It reminded me of the situation in Philadelphia some years ago when there were 2 telephone systems. If you had only a bell phone, you couldn't call anyone who had only a keystone phone. The interior of his mouth was blue, and so was the inside of his eyelids. He said his world had 3 moons. You may imagine my emotions at hearing that my long-felt dream to communicate with otherworldly forms of sentient life was at last realized. And to think that they had singled out not the President of the United States, not the Director General of the UN, but me, Morris Goldpepper, DDS. Could human happiness ask for more, was my unspoken question. I laughed softly to myself, and I thought, what would my cousin Nathaniel Pomerantz say now? I was like wax in this extraterrestrial person's hands. He had 6 distinct and articulate digits on each one, and I easily agreed to say nothing to anyone until the question of diplomatic recognition could be arranged on a higher echelon. Non-recognition has its advantages, Goldpepper, dental surgeon, he said with a slight smile. No passport for your visit you will need. Well, a personal invitation to visit Proxima Centauri Gamma or whatever the planet's name is. But I felt constrained to look this gift horse just a little closer in the mouth. How is it that they came inviting me, and not, let us say, Oppenheimer? Well, of his gifts not in need we are, surgical Goldpepper. We have passed as far beyond nuclear power as you have beyond wind power. We can span the universe. But in dentistry, like children still we are. Come and inspect our faculties of your science, great Goldpepper. If you say, this yes, then it will be yes. If you direct this no, then it will be no. In respect to the science of dentistry, our Edison and our Columbus you will be. I asked when we would leave, and he said in 8 days. I asked how long the trip would take. For a moment I was baffled when he said it would take no longer than to walk the equivalent of the length of the lab floor. Then he revealed his meaning to me. Teleportation. Of course. No spaceship needed. My next emotion was a brief disappointment at not being able to see the blazing stars in black outer space. But after all, one ought not be greedy at such a time. I cannot point out too strongly that at no time did I accept or agree to accept any payment or gratuity for this trip. I looked upon it in the same light as the work I have done for various clinics. Should I take along books, equipment, What? I asked my, so to speak, guide. He shook his head. Only my presence was desired on the first trip. A visit of inspection. Very well. On the morning of November 8th, I wrote a brief note to my old and dear friend Dr. Samuel Fadiman, the senior mentor of American dentistry. On hearing these words, the elder statesman sobbed softly into his cupped hands. And in the afternoon, so excited and enthralled that I noticed no more of my destination than that it was north of the Washington Market, I accompanied my guide to a business building in the aforesaid area. He led me into a darkened room. He clicked a switch. There was a humming noise, a feeling first of heaviness, then of weightlessness, and then an odd sort of light came on. I was no longer on the familiar planet of my birth. I was on an unknown world. Over my head, the 3 moons of this far-off globe sailed majestically through a sky wherein I could note unfamiliar constellations. The thought occurred to me that poets on this planet would have to find another rhyme, inasmuch as moons, plural form, does not go with June, singular form. One satellite was a pale yellow, one was brown, and the third was a creamy pink. Not knowing the names of these lunary orbs in their native tongue, I decided to call them vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry. Whilst my mind was filled with these droll fancies, I felt a tug at my sleeve, where my guide was holding it. He gestured, and I followed. Now, I thought to myself, he will bring me before the president of their Galactic Council, or whatever he's called. And I stood obediently within a circle marked on the surface of the platform whereon we stood. In a moment, we were teleported to an inside room somewhere, and there I gazed about me in stupefaction, not to say astonishment. My eyes discerned the forms of Bunsen burners, Baldor lathes, casting machines and ovens, denture trays, dental stone, plaster, shellac trays, wires of teeth, and all the necessary equipment of a fully equipped dental prosthetic laboratory. My surprise at the progress made by these people in the science at which they were allegedly still children was soon mitigated by the realization that all the items had been made on Earth. As I was looking and examining, a door opened, and several people entered. Their faces were a pale blue, and I realized suddenly that my guide must be wearing makeup to conceal his original complexion. They spoke together in their native dialect. Then one of them, with a rod of some kind in his hand, turned to me. He opened his mouth. I perceived his gums were bare. "Dentical person," he said. "Make me teeth." I turned in some perplexity to my guide. "I understood you to say my first visit would be one of inspection only." Everyone laughed, and I observed that all were equally toothless. The man in the chair poked me rudely with his rod or staff. "Talk not, make teeth." Fuming with a well-justified degree of indignation, I protested at such a gross breach of the laws of common hospitality. Then, casting concealment to the winds, these people informed me as follows. Their race is entirely toothless in the adult stage. They are an older race than ours and are born looking ancient and wrinkled. It is only comparatively recently that they have established contact with Earth, and in order that they should not appear conspicuous and in order to be able to eat our food, they realized that they must be supplied with artificial teeth. My so-called guide, false friend, my enticer and/or kidnapper, to give him his due, had gotten fitted at a dentist's in New York and cunningly inquired who was the leading man in the field. Alas for fame. The man answered without a second of hesitation, "That is no other one than Morris Goldpepper, DDS, perfecter of the semi-retractable clasp." First, this unscrupulous extraterrestrial procured the equipment, then he procured me. "Do I understand that you purport that I assist you in a plan to thwart and otherwise circumvent the immigration laws of the United States?" was my inquiry. The man in the chair poked me with his rod again. "You understand. So now make teeth." What a proposition to make to a law-abiding, patriotic American citizen by birth. What a demand to exact of a war veteran, a taxpayer, and one who has been 3 times on jury duty since 1946 alone. People versus Garrity, People versus Vanderdam, and Lipschitz versus Crazy Cut Cool Caps, Inc. My whole being revolted. I spoke coldly to them, informing them that the situation was contrary to my conception of dental ethics, but to no avail. My treacherous dragoman drew a revolver from his pocket. Our weapons understand, you do not. Primitive earth weapons, yes. So proceed with manufacture, imprisoned Goldpepper. I went hot and cold. Not, I beg of you to understand, with fear, but with humiliation. Imprisoned Goldpepper? The phrase, with all the connotations it implied, rang in my ears. I bowed my head, and the phrase from the literary work Samson Agonistes, studied as a student in the College of the City of New York, rang through my mind. Eyeless in Gaza, grinding corn, oh, blind, blind, amidst the blaze of noon. But even in this hour of mental agony, an agony which had scarcely abated to speak of, I had the first glimmering of the idea which I hope will enable me to warn Earth. Without a word, but only a scornful glance to show these blue-complected individuals how well I appreciated that their so-called advanced science was a mere veneer over the base metal of their boorishness, I set to work. I made the preliminary impressions and studied casts, using an impression tray with oval floor form, the best suited for taking impressions of edentulous ridges. And so began the days of my slavery. Confined as I am here, there is neither day nor night, but an unremitting succession of Frenum trims, post dams, boxing in, pouring up, festoon carving, fixing sprue channels, and all the innumerable details of dental prosthetic work. No one assists me, no one converses with me, save in brusque barks relevant to the work at hand. My food consists of liqueous and gelatinous substances, such as might be expected would form the diet of a toothless race. Oh, I am sick of the sight of their blue skins, blue mouths, and horny ridges. I am sick of my slavish serfdom. I have been given material to keep records, and am writing this in expectation of later reducing it in size by the method here employed, and of thereafter inserting copies between the palatal and occlusal surfaces of the plates. It will be necessary to make such plates imperfect, so that the wearers will be obliged to go to dentists on Earth for repairs, because it is not always practical for them to teleport. In fact, I believe they can only do it on the 8th day of every 3rd month. Naturally, I cannot do this to every plate, for they might become suspicious. You may well imagine how it goes against my grain to produce defective work. But I have no other choice. Twice they have brought me fresh dental supplies, which is how I calculate their teleporting cycle. I have my wristwatch with me, and thus I am enabled to reckon the passing of time. What their exact purpose is in going to Earth, I do not know. My growing suspicion is that their much-vaunted superior science is a fraud, and that their only superiority lies in the ability to teleport. One curious item may give a clue. They have questioned me regarding the old age assistance programs of the several states. As I have said, they all look old. Can it be said that elsewhere on this planet there is imprisoned some poor devil of a terrestrial printer or engraver, toiling under duress to produce forged birth certificates and other means of identification, to the fell purpose of allowing these aliens to live at ease at the financial expense of the already overburdened U.S. taxpayer? To whom shall I address my plea for help? To the federal government? But it has no official or even unofficial knowledge that this otherworldly race exists. The FBI? But does teleporting under false pretenses to another planet constitute kidnapping across state lines? It seems the only thing I can do is to implore whichever dental practitioner reads these lines to communicate at once with the American Dental Association. I throw myself upon the mercy of my fellow professional men. Dentists and dental prostheticians, Beware of men with blue mouths and horny edentulous ridges. Do not be deceived by flattery and false promises. Remember the fate of that most miserable of men, Morris Goldpepper, DDS. And in his horrible predicament, help, oh, help him. 3. A long silence followed the reading of this document. At length it was broken by Dr. Hanson. "That brave man," he said in a husky voice. "That brave little man." "Poor Morris," said Dr. Danbourge. "Think of him imprisoned on a far-off planet, slaving like a convict in a salt mine, so to speak, making false teeth for these inhuman aliens, sending these messages to us across the trackless void. It's pitiful, and yet, doctors, it is also a tribute to the indomitable spirit of man." Dr. Weinroth moved his huge hands. "I'd like to get a hold of just one of those blue bastards," he growled. Dr. Rourke cleared his throat. All present looked at their president respectfully and eagerly. "I need hardly tell you, doctors," he said crisply, "that the ADA is a highly conservative organization. We do not go about things lightly. One such message we might ignore, but there have been 11 reported, all identical with the first. Even 11 such messages we might perhaps not consider, but when they come from a prominent scientist of the stature of Dr. Morris Goldpepper, handwriting experts have pronounced this to be his handwriting beyond cavil of a doubt. Here," he delved into a box, "are the 11 plates in question. Can any of you look at these clean lines and deny that they are the work of the incomparable Goldpepper?" The 6 other men looked at the objects, shook their heads. "Beautiful," murmured Dr. Smith, "even in their broken state. Poems in plastic. MG couldn't produce bad work if he tried." Dr. Rourke continued. "Each report confirmed that the person who brought in the plate had a blue mouth and edentulous ridges, just as the message states. Each blue-mouthed patient exhibited the outward appearance of old age. And, gentlemen, of those 11, no less than 8 were reported from the state of California. Do you realize what that means? California offers the highest amount of financial assistance to the elderly. Goldpepper's surmise was right." Dr. Hanson leaned forward. "In addition, our reports show that 5 of those 8 are leaders in the fight against fluoridation of drinking water. It is my carefully considered belief that there is something in their physical makeup, evolved on another planet, which cannot tolerate fluorine even in minute quantities, because they certainly, being already toothless, wouldn't be concerned with the prevention of decay." Young Dr. McAllister took the floor. "We have checked with dental supply houses and detail men in the New York metropolitan area, and we found that large quantities of prosthetic supplies have been delivered to an otherwise unknown outfit called the Export Company, located not far north of the Washington market. There is every reason to believe that this is the place Dr. Goldpepper mentioned. One of our men went there, found present only one man, in appearance an old man. Our representative feigned deafness, thus obliging this person to open his mouth and talk loudly. Doctors, he reports that this person has a blue mouth." There was a deep intake of breath around the table. Dr. Rourke leaned forward and snapped off the tape recorders. "This next is off the record. It is obvious, doctors, that no ordinary methods will suffice to settle this case, to ensure the return of our unfortunate colleague, or to secure the withdrawal of these extraterrestrial individuals from our nation and planet. I cannot, of course, officially endorse what might be termed strong-arm methods. At the same time, I feel that our adversaries are not entitled to polite treatment, and obviously the usual channels of law enforcement are completely closed to us. Therefore, and remember, no word of this must pass outside our circle. Therefore, I have communicated something of this matter to Mr. Albert Anapolo, the well-known waterfront figure, who not long ago inaugurated the splendid longshoreman's dental health plan. Mr. Anapolo is a somewhat rough person, but he is nonetheless a loyal American. We know now the Achilles heel of these alien creatures. It is fluorine. We know also how to identify them, and I think we may shortly be able to announce results. Meanwhile, he drew a slip of paper from his pocket. It is already the 1st of the month in that quarter when the dental supplies are due to be transported, or teleported, as Dr. Goldpepper terms it, to their distant destination. A large shipment is waiting to be delivered from the warehouses of a certain wholesaler to the premises of the exporting company. I have had copies of this made and wrapped around each 3-ounce bottle of Ellen Bogan's Denture Stickfast. I presume it meets with your approval?" He handed it to Dr. Hansen, who, as the others present nodded in grimly emphatic approval, read it aloud. "From the American Dental Association, representing over 45,000 registered dentists in the United States and its territories, to Dr. Morris Goldpepper. Wherever you may be, do not despair. We are intent upon your rescue. We will bend every effort to this end. We shall fight the good fight. Have courage, Dr. Morris Goldpepper. You shall return."
All right, what'd you think?
Judy Lynn Del Rey once said to me that science fiction humor doesn't sell. And I promptly went out and wrote a couple of humorous science fiction novels, Glory Lane and Quozel, that sold quite well. And I just think Judy Lynn, for all of her astuteness as an editor, missed on that one. It's just that science fiction humor is difficult to write because you can write science fiction but not humor, and you can write humor but not science fiction. And to put the two together and have true science fiction that's also funny is very difficult. There, Morris Goldpepper, even the title of the story tells you what you're in for. Help, I am Dr. Morris Goldpepper. My favorite science fiction writer of all time was a man named Eric Frank Russell, British writer who wrote a lot of serious science fiction, but also wrote some of the funniest science fiction I ever heard. In fact, they wrote the story that to this day was still the highest rated story in their local land lab ever to appear in astounding analog science fiction, a story called Plus X. And what you do is you have to incorporate the science fiction elements, you have to incorporate the humor into the science fiction. It has to be an integral part of the story. You can't do Flash Gordon with pratfalls. It doesn't work. You're just throwing banana peels and stuff into the story. It has to be, if you have sentient banana peels, then maybe you're onto something. It has to be an integral part of the story. The Morris Goldpepper stories, the humor is integral to the science fiction. You don't separate the two. It's like, this wouldn't be a funny story if it wasn't science fiction. That's the best way I can think of to describe it.
Did you ever read the sequel?
Yes.
And before I talk about the sequel real quick, one of the things, I guess I want to get your thoughts on this. There's Help, I'm Dr. Morris Goldpepper. There's the sequel, but there's the middle of what happens in between. And I don't think we ever get that part other than ultimately he's rescued, obviously. Do you any thought? I mean, I don't know if Avram wrote something that wasn't published or he purposely did that. He said it doesn't matter. I was curious if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, I certainly can't say he didn't write it, but I suspect, given the success of the first story, that somebody would have bought a middle section if there was a middle section. I just think it didn't interest him. And this happens with writers all the time, to the ultimate frustration of readers. It's like, this is not interesting to me. This is what I want to write. So I'm going to write this and forget about the other stuff, because the writer has it in his head what happened. And you have to be very careful as a writer about this. If you're writing a story, particularly like a linear story, and you don't include an explanatory session between part 1 and part 3, let's say, makes it really tough on the reader. But with short stories, it's not such a big deal. With a novel, that would never fly. An editor would never let that pass. You're going to do one where you just do part 1 and part 3, they have to be self-contained. which Morris is.
Yeah.
But yeah, it could be frustrating for a lot of people. I think that Avram had that in his head, said, I know what happens here after the first story, but I don't want to write that. This is what I want to write. And people, will like it and understand it, or they won't. And I don't think anybody read the sequel. You maybe.
I did. I've read the sequel.
No, I mean, read the sequel and thought, wait, we're missing the middle section here. Because there was time between the two stories.
Right.
So,
I mean, my thought is, Avram in general, he didn't write in general big action scenes. That was never his style. And I think that middle would have been, I mean, maybe not, but it seemed like it would have involved this army of dentists coming to do something. I don't know what it was, but maybe it would have been more clever than that. I'm sure it would have been more clever than that.
I just don't think he wanted to write it. Like, nobody cares about part 2 anyway. I certainly don't. So I'm going to go directly to part 3. When you're a writer, you can do that. Also, it's very difficult to do big explosive things with short stories.
Right.
He wrote what interested him, and I mean, if you want a straightforward writer's take on it, I'm sure he wrote the second story because the first story sold, and he figured he could sell the second story. Sometimes that's all the motivation that a writer needs.
Right. Any other thoughts on the story, or?
Not offhand, no.
Okay. I mean, this is perfect. So great. I cannot, I've taken a lot of your time. I know you've, thank you so much. And, I'm getting everything. I don't know if you enjoy listening to audiobooks, but obviously I'm getting, because I don't come from the literary world, what I've been able to control is putting things out in audio, because that's something that I can do. And I've been having a lot of fun with it. I typically read each story, then I put it out in audio, then I listen to it again, and then I read it with the audio. And that, because sometimes the stories take a little bit of work for me to to interpret, which is fun.
I grew up with this stuff. It's just like classical music. If you start listening to classical music when you're 4 or 5 years old, then when you're in high school and you're listening to it, and your friends look at you cross-eyed, most of them, because they're listening to things like Itsy Bitsy Wee Yellow Polka Dot Bikini, or, that's my era growing up. They don't understand what you're doing because you don't have the background in it. And it could be the same thing with science fiction. If you don't have background in, dare I say, serious science fiction or literary science fiction, and you only know it from movies and TV, it can be difficult to pick up a story by Philip K. Dick, even if you've seen a film based on a story by Philip K. Dick, and puzzle out what's going on. Never mind a lot of the stuff that hasn't been filmed.
All right, let me ask you one more question. I can't remember what year this was published. Let's say it was in the 50s or 60s. So in the 50s or 60s, Avram's talking about William Morton, the former dentist, who's the creator of anesthesia, using ether. That's who the dentists go touch the picture of. That's who they idolize. I mean, you're reading that. Where do you go? Do you just what do you do with that information back then? Because now I immediately go onto the internet and I look them up and I say, that's who it is. But back then, I'm imagining most people aren't going to know. So what do? Do you go to an encyclopedia? Do you go to the library? I mean, how in depth do you go if you're reading a story with that little minutia in there? I guess that's what I'm trying to figure out.
Well, pre-internet, if you grew up in a half literate household, there would be a basic encyclopedia.
Right.
Britannica, Americana, something. And that's what you would go to. I did that a lot. We had a very simple, cheap, basic binding encyclopedia. And I was in it all the time because I would constantly run across references in film or in stories I was reading, and nonfiction as well, that I would want to explore further. Now, of course, we have the internet. Prior to the internet, we had encyclopedias. And that's what you did. I wrote a historical novel called Maori. It's my only historical novel, set in 19th century New Zealand. And I can tell you that trying to research 19th century New Zealand in Prescott, Arizona, pre-internet, didn't yield a lot of usable information. So what I did was I started writing various university libraries when I had questions and saying, can you answer this question or tell me something about this subject? So I was able to incorporate all that, but it's the same idea. It's just far more laborious. I mean, one of these days we'll have a little snood. Remember snoods? That's what women wore in the Middle Ages with the weave with the little gems in there.
Yep.
Have a direct mind internet interface, and you will think your question and the answer will magically appear. Or, to you. And that's going to be wonderful. It should lead to smarter people. I mean, the last 4 years in this country, I'm not sure that it has. But hope springs eternal.
Absolutely. I'll have to read your book. You and I definitely have a connection there in terms of New Zealand. It is my favorite place on the planet. I've been there 7 times in the last few years, and I'm going to definitely read your book. So,
I think you'll like it. Having been there, you'll recognize, even though it's fiction, it speaks exactly to what we were talking about, but it's all fact-based. I mean, some characters are invented. Some of them, not all of them. There's some real historical person. I don't want to spoil the book for you.
Yeah, no. I'll definitely. I mean, I've read the entire history of New Zealand, Captain Cook, everything. So I'll definitely have to get that book for sure.
Well, I think you'll like this. I think you'll like Maori. I always hoped that Peter Jackson would pick it up. The book's written in 6 parts. Would make a nice miniseries, but
he better.
I don't know Peter Jackson, and he certainly doesn't know me.
Peter, if you're listening, make it. Alan, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right, we'll be in touch.